I'm Robert Hill. I'm Colonel USAR JAG. Presently, I serve as an ambassador for the Office of Chief of Army Reserves, and he sends his greetings and puts his imprimatur on this particular educational event. This is one of the things that we do in MOA. We've done a number of seminars. This started in the 80s and 90s with some seminars at Trinity on national defense and foreign policy. But we've evolved. We did a seminar with the Hartford, University of Hartford, and last year we were smart enough to partner up with the World Affairs Council, and I have to say, I can't say enough about them. Our seminars are minor, we're minor compared to the extent that they go to run a seminar. It's just amazing, and we can sort of step aside and give them our mailing list and make a bunch of calls to bring some people here and maybe have a little input on what's in the seminar. But they are terrific people. They're wonderful to work with. They're cooperative, and I just can't say enough about them in this. This morning, there's a couple things I'd like to mention. We have a number of ROTC people here, and would you stand when I read your name? Ann Allen, is she here? There she is, yeah. Alexander Block, Rachel Blumenthal, Cassie Tupo, Ariel Machedo, Rachel Meyer, Brian Oliveri, and Cameron Tunnell. Give me. It's really great to have these young people here, and for the World Affairs Council to give them a break on the admissions. Are there other guests? I understand there's cadets from the Coast Guard Academy here. Are they? Would they stand? Great. Oh, this is really great. Are there other guests of college? Are there students? Are there other students here from high school? Or I understood there may be some. There. Would you stand up, please? Well, this is really great. It's going to be an event when we have all these young people involved. I'm sure they'll have some good questions for the speakers. I think we'll go ahead. I'm not going to go into some extensive introductions, but the first person, Megan Torrey, is very important to us. She's been very friendly to us. She's creative. She has ideas. She makes things happen. She's a person that's invaluable to our seminar. And I'd like to present Megan at this time.
So good morning, everyone. I'm, as Mr. Hill said, Megan Torrey. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. And I have the lucky job of thanking everyone today. And I want to thank everyone for taking their time out, for joining at the World Affairs Council Global Security Forum 2018. We're so happy to have you here. These programs can't happen without community support. So today I want to thank our sponsors for today: Stanley Security, United Technologies, Pratt & Whitney, the Mohegan Tribe, the Harvard Business Journal, Goodwin College, of course, we're all in this wonderful space, the Retired Officers Association, and Nick Cato Photo. I also want to thank our partners, because at the World Affairs Council, one of the tenets of how we operate is all about community partnership. All of us work to make this community a better place. And at the World Affairs Council, we work to connect all of you to what's going on in the world. So I'm so thankful that this year we're working with the McCain Institute for International Leadership, and we have some guests that you're going to hear from very soon from the McCain Institute. From the Connecticut National Guard, we have Major General Yvonne with us here today, and we're very thankful for their partnership. And to all of my colleagues with the World Affairs Councils around New England who were partners in this, and I know we have already with us this morning the board chair of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts. So thank you to everybody, and I really want to give a thank you to our speakers. At the World Affairs Council, this is how we're able to do our job. Everyone here that you're going to hear from today has volunteered their time to be with us, and we are so lucky as a community to be able to hear from these amazing people, these amazing thinkers, and I really want to give a special thanks to everyone today. I know you didn't come to hear me, so I'm about to turn it over to our MC for the day, a very good friend of the World Affairs Council who's been instrumental in making this Global Security Forum happen, Major General Michael Jones.
Well, thanks, Megan, and for all of you, welcome today. Normally Megan goes through this extensive introduction of me. I am kind of disappointed. I'm also kind of disappointed. My role today is kind of be the leader of the band. And part of the reason that's appropriate is I'm kind of an amateur musician. You know, I play the guitar. I really enjoy playing the guitar with other people, and those guitarists in the audience know exactly what I'm talking about, you know, kind of synchronizing, leading the band and so forth. And, you know, as guitar players, you know, we have a saying, everybody knows, you know, what 100 banjos at the bottom of the ocean are. A good start, you know, but I apologize up front for any banjo players we might have. I can't imagine there'd be very many in the audience. Hey, so today, the theme of our conference today is new global powers. And there could not be a time in terms of how the world is evolving where this could be a more important discussion. So I'm really excited that you all are here today. Part of the reason it's important, I talked to a group last night, and the way I sort of explained it is that from time to time I hear this conversation go on, and I hear people say, you know, I don't believe in globalism. And a question I always want to ask is, well, you know, do those same people not believe in air? Because to me, globalism is not a belief, it's a condition. The fact is that we are all interconnected in this world in lots of different ways. We're interconnected by communication, we're interconnected by commerce, in some cases we're interconnected by history, by culture, by family, but in many, many ways we're in this interconnected world. And the fact that you're here to talk about this world and the global dynamics, which by definition means they change, is very, very important. So I'd like to welcome you all, tell you how grateful we are for your participation, for all the speakers we have today. I'll up front, because I'll certainly forget to thank them in the end, I'd like to say thank you to them. So no discussion about new global powers could possibly happen without the topic of our first panel. And if you look in your agenda there, you'll see that it's Battlefields of the Future, Confronting and Combating Terrorism. So we're privileged today to have Luke Knittig, who, as Megan's already mentioned, the Senior Director of Communications of the McCain Institute, who's going to lead that panel. And just a few things about Luke. You probably know a little bit about the McCain Institute. He'll probably tell you more about it if you get the chance to talk to him. But he served in the military. One of the folks he worked for is no stranger to the Connecticut World Affairs Council, General Corelli, good mutual friend of ours. He served in a number of units, the mighty 1st Armored Division, Iron Soldiers, as well as the 3rd Infantry Division. He served in combat in ISAF in Afghanistan. So a distinguished servant of the nation who's found a way to continue to serve in the fine institute that he works in now. So please join me in welcoming our first panel on combating terrorism. Luke?
I'm not going to step on that. Clint, I think we'll put you here. And General Jones, you're too kind, and it was an honor to get to serve. We never served directly together, but our paths, I enjoyed your leadership, that's for sure. And this guy, as y'all know, was part of some of the toughest missions that you could ever be a part of, and helped them happen successfully. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our panel on Battlefields of the Future, Confronting and Combating Terrorism. How I'd like it to work is we certainly need to introduce the unbelievable panelists that we have here today. I'm going to give them an opportunity to make a brief opening statement. We have a few rounds of questions I'd like to lead them through, and then we'll turn it over to you for the really good questions and engagement that we'd all like to see. First off, can everybody hear me okay? And we're all settled and ready to go. Okay. Let me begin with Nick Rasmussen. He's the Senior Director of the McCain Institute's Counterterrorism Program, really soon to be programs. He's also a distinguished professor of practice at the Arizona State University Sandra Day O'Connor Law School. Although he's not a lawyer, I think he would be quick to tell you. Absolutely. He doesn't disparage lawyers, but I did want to put that out there. He's a national security expert with over 27 years in the U.S. government service. Since 2001, Rasmussen has served in the intelligence community, most recently as director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He's held senior posts across 3 White House administrations, served in senior positions in the National Security Council staff under Presidents Bush and Obama, and then, of course, was appointed as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center by President Obama, and continued into the Trump administration. Highly recruited at the end of 2017. University of Texas wanted bad, but the McCain Institute got him, and I'm proud that we did. You have his longer bio. You can go on and on. He's received some of the nation's top awards. You'll see him on NBC and in the media, which for my job is really nice. He was part of things like the bin Laden raid and going on, very, very serious business that he was a part of. And he went to college about 20 miles away, if I have it right, at Western, so he's no real stranger to this neck of the woods. So let's everybody welcome Nick Rasmussen. And then we move to Clint Morano, also not a stranger to this neck of the woods. He currently serves as the unit chief for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's National Joint Terrorism Task Force, located at the National Counterterrorism Center in Virginia. He's been at that for, well, right at 3 years, if I'm reading this right. Oversight of 900 FBI agents and task force officers assigned to FBI offices across the country. You look at the programs that he oversees, it's just staggering to me. Civil aviation security, campus liaison, seems germane where we're meeting at here today, maritime security, pipeline security, the tripwire program, not even sure what that is, but it sounds terribly important, rail security program, and has been at the operation, and I dare I say tactical, also strategic level involved for decades, was on the scene after 9/11 and investigating that, and is very much in the thick of things now. So let's please give him a warm welcome. So when I think of our topic, the battlefield of the future to do with counterterrorism, as an old soldier, nothing like General Jones, but an old soldier nonetheless, the things that kind of go through my head, okay, battlefields, fog of war, strategy, kind of where operation meets tactics, meets the tactical level, intelligence, kind of where the decisive points that you're even fighting the fight, if that's how you're choosing to do it. That's the kind of thing that goes through my head, and you have folks that have been really involved with it for decades, and then have very strong ideas of where we should go forward. So against that backdrop, I'm going to turn Nick first to pick it up wherever he'd like, either with what he's doing with the McCain Institute or kind of what he's done in the past, to share a few thoughts, and then we'll turn to Clint. Nick, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Luke, and it's a great privilege to be back in central Connecticut. As Luke mentioned, I went to school at Wesleyan, just a few miles down the road here, and really did enjoy my time in central Connecticut. In some ways, the theme of this conference, focusing on emerging great power challenges and great power conflict, is itself newsworthy. Because again, I suspect if we had this discussion 4 or 5 years ago, or even 2 or 3 years ago, the focus would have been almost entirely on terrorism, on ISIS, on what was going on in the terrorism arena. And indeed, for much of the post-9/11 era, terrorism and counterterrorism, to my mind, had first claim on a lot of things. First claim on the agenda for national security, first claim on resources within the federal government. It was pretty hard not to ask for something in the counterterrorism world when you were in a position like mine at the National Counterterrorism Center and not get it. But I would argue that that's changing in some ways. I'm not going to argue that the terrorism and counterterrorism challenge is diminishing, and we'll talk about why as the conversation unfolds, why I don't think it is diminishing. But what is happening is that other critical national security issues are gaining in prominence. The set of national security challenges we face as a country goes well beyond terrorism and counterterrorism right now, and some of that will be covered over the course of the day today. Cyber challenges, challenges posed by Russia and China, challenges posed by Iran and North Korea, and you could go on and on. And so as I left government service about 10 months ago, what I was bequeathing to my successor in many ways as a counterterrorism professional was something that was going to be more complicated and more difficult, because he or she, when he or she ultimately comes on board as my replacement at the National Counterterrorism Center, will face the same set of problems that I faced, but probably have to argue a little harder to get their share of the pie in terms of resources. And I'm not here to argue that that's wrong, because as I said, the list of national security challenges that we're facing as a country has broadened pretty significantly in recent years. I had coffee a couple of weeks ago with a Wesleyan student who just graduated a couple of months ago, and trying to help him as he thought about job opportunities. And he had a great academic background, but I thought the most interesting thing of his academic background was that he was a Russian studies major, and he had Russian linguistic skills. And I thought, well, that was a pretty foresighted thing to do a few years ago when you were in college. You probably thought Cold War stuff didn't matter anymore. But what I advised him was, look at the website for the Bureau. I bet they're looking for Russian linguists. Look at the website for the Central Intelligence Agency or the Defense Intelligence Agency, or a half dozen other governmental organizations, because that problem set is going to be very much on our minds going forward. And while I was glad to help this young guy get started in the field of Russian studies, I was also thinking to myself, I hope we don't lose talented young professionals who work counterterrorism issues too, because again, as we'll talk about during the conversation this morning, that problem set, that counterterrorism problem set, is not likely to go away anytime soon. I'll stop there, Luke.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Clint?
So, from my perspective, of course, I live and breathe counterterrorism every day, and have been doing so for pretty much the last 17 years of my 19 years in the FBI. But I did start off working counterintelligence in New York City, and I would propose that we probably should have never took our eye off the ball when it came to the counter-intel threat posed by the Russians, or I would still like to call them the Soviet Union, because that's really what they are, just by another name, and the Chinese. But that was a decision made way above my pay grade. But to focus back on the counterterrorism side, to the FBI, it's still our #1 priority, and it will be for my future and probably your children's future. It's a long war that we're involved in against the terrorism, because it's an ideology that we have yet to counter. It's a rhetoric that's pervasive, and it seduces people into doing things that you normally would not think capable of. And it's there, and it's not going to end anytime soon. And it's become even more difficult than I'd say post 9/11, because 9/11 and right after, it was one big target, was Al-Qaeda and the whole infrastructure, and working closely with our DoD friends, it was easy to take them out. Well, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it was easier to go after a hierarchical organization like it would be to go after the mafia, where you knew you had the leader of the family and the capos and the soldiers, and you could hit them one by one and work your way up. And to a certain extent, that's what we did with Al-Qaeda and what we're doing with our DoD friends with ISIS. But what has happened with ISIS, they've changed the whole game. They're not so much interested in, as Al-Qaeda was, in that one giant attack, that one big incident that'll like they did on 9/11. They're more interested in just you out going and doing anything, meaning pick up a knife, go stab someone, get in a car, run people over, pick up a gun, shoot someone. If you really put time and effort into it, build your own improvised explosive device and blow something up. And that, combined with what we see as the most major threat to the United States, that of your homegrown violent extremists, makes it very, very difficult for the FBI to try and counter this. And we can talk about this more as we go on. But so from my perspective, the counterterrorism threat is still very real, and it will be the FBI's #1 priority for some time to come.
Clint, thanks for that. I think you've each set us up nicely to be able to do a deep dive, and we're going to do that in just a quick minute, but we're going to have a speed round of a question first, maybe just for my education as much as anything, because you're the perfectly placed people to answer this. So Nick, I'd like you to give us a little snapshot of what the National Counterterrorism Center is, because it strikes me as one of those things you think you know what it is, but I'm not sure I have it right.
Sure.
And then Clint, if you could tell us what the FBI's National Joint Terror Task Force really is.
Sure, Luke. The National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, was one of those post-9/11 creations of the federal government that emerged out of the 9/11 Commission and the very painful, I would say, but very honest period of introspection that we went through as a government after 9/11. It was very clear that something had failed, that something had gone amiss, that we as a government had failed to live up to that first responsibility to keep our fellow citizens safe. So the National Counterterrorism Center was created out of that experience. It was designed to be an information hub for the government so that all information related to terrorism could be fused and analyzed, assessed in one place. And that would include information, the most sensitive information that CIA would gather from its human intelligence operations overseas, or NSA would gather in its signals intelligence work. But also that information would be married with FBI case files and sensitive FBI investigations here inside the United States. The idea being that we would create for ourselves what we didn't have at the time of 9/11, and that is one complete holistic information picture of what the bad guys were trying to do to us. So in that role as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, I led about 1,000 people focused on that mission. I often found myself as a spokesperson for the entire U.S. intelligence community, presenting to our policymakers, our senior policymakers, including the President and the Congress, and occasionally the media. This is the terrorism threat as we understand it, and reflecting all of the diversity of views within our intelligence community, but trying to present on behalf of the intelligence community that picture of the threat we face so that we can have a clear sense of strategy and policy aimed at that threat.
So the National Joint Terrorism Task Force, of course, it's part of the FBI's Counterterrorism Division. We are physically located with most of the Counterterrorism Division at the National Counterterrorism Center in a building. There's 2 separate buildings. We're in building LX1. We have 40 different agencies that make up the National Joint Terrorism Task Force, ranging anywhere. Our newest member is NASA, because we are leading the way in Space Force. So sorry for the Air Force, General. Sorry that the FBI is already ahead of you on that one. And then
the FBI's in space. I didn't know that.
Absolutely.
This was good for my education.
There you go. And then so we have and a lot of military, all the military services represented as well. And we also oversee 10 different programs. We're actually broken into 2 different units because the span of control is quite large. And I got to get a good dose of that over the last 6 months because I was in charge of both units. So it's about 80 people physically at the National Joint Terrorism Task Force and those 10 separate programs. You mentioned some of them, but we also have the Military Operations Support Team, which came out of the Fort Hood shooting where there was a lack of communication between DOD and FBI, and we had to create a memorandum of understanding. So now there's a free exchange of information whenever there's a subject of an FBI investigation who has a DOD affiliation, or DOD comes across someone who might have some terrorism nexus, and they have to notify us of that. So we work together on that. We also have what we call SAMs, which is your Special Administrative Measures, and we monitor all the mail coming out of ADX or Supermax of all your top, we're up to about 20-some different high-profile terrorists that have been arrested and incarcerated. So we monitor all their communications in and out of there. We also have a criminal intelligence program where we're out, and we have representatives in all 56 field offices that work with the local and state corrections, because I'll talk about this a little later. But a lot of the mitigation strategy now that we're doing is to disrupt these terrorist investigations as early as possible, and we leverage our state local partners to do that. So they're actually being incarcerated on state charges before they get to federal. And the issue that we're having with that right now, which should be of some concern to people, is that we're now 17 years after 9/11, and a lot of the people that were originally arrested on terrorism charges or other state charges will now start to be let go. And we're in the process of trying to figure out how to deal with that because, unfortunately, people don't seem to change their colors while they're in prison. They just seem to perfect exactly what they do. So those are the type of things we do. Then we have the other, like I said, 1,000 agents in the field or more. We also oversee all 194 JTTFs across the country. We provide them with their budget, their overtime for task force officers, their phones, their cars. We're involved in policy and strategy. One of the biggest ones we just came up with. We helped create that counter-UAS legislation that just went through Congress. So that was something that my aviation guys worked on, and I actually had to testify in Congress to talk about that threat and other threats to aviation. So we're involved in all those big things, and then we also get down in the actual operational things, helping our international terrorism operations section and domestic terrorism operations section with working the cases out in the field. Because there are about 5,000 current counterterrorism cases right now in the FBI. And just last year alone, we made 86 international terrorism arrests and over 120 domestic terrorism arrests. So it's a busy, ongoing operation.
So thanks for that, and I think that was a good speed round. Really back to our battlefield construct now, if you will, and I think I'm really looking for you've lived this and are living this. I'm really hoping to kind of pull out your visceral, your passion on this. How has the counterterrorism landscape, priorities and strategies shifted and shaped? And I think we're really talking post 9/11 here, but pick up on it wherever you want. You've seen it the way we probably haven't.
Sure, and if you step back from kind of and Clint alluded to some of this, if you step back from the picture of where we were in the period after 9/11, when we faced an adversary in Al-Qaeda that had carried out a catastrophic attack against the United States, and I would argue at that time had the capability to do that again if we hadn't been successfully able to go on the offense against Al-Qaeda, principally operating in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so for a long period of time after 9/11, we lived with the specter of that large-scale, mass casualty, catastrophic attack. And that was the principal thing we worked at to make sure it didn't happen again. If you look at the threat environment we're in now, I would argue, I would align myself with what Clint said. It is a very different threat environment. It is in many ways a more complicated and more challenging threat environment, and it's maybe more difficult to counter or more difficult to mitigate that threat environment, but it is different and in some ways more manageable. I would argue we have done a terrific job at reducing very dramatically the likelihood of that large-scale mass casualty catastrophic attack. For all the reasons you know, for all of the good work that our Defense Department colleagues, our military colleagues, our intelligence colleagues have done in a host of different conflict zones around the world, getting after that threat, we are less at risk of that kind of large-scale attack. At the same time, there has definitely been a democratization of the terrorist narrative, the jihadist narrative, for lack of a better word, and more individuals around the world today probably subscribe to that narrative than at any point in our recent history. So now that threat really is, particularly here in the homeland, that threat is mostly tied to individuals or individuals operating in very small groups who might seek to carry out something much more achievable than a 9/11 style attack. And while, again, that is a tremendous good news story, we are not at risk, as I said, nearly to the degree that we were of that large-scale mass casualty attack. On the other hand, we all know just how unsettling it can be to find yourself in a situation where some random act of terrorist violence, as Clint said, a car up on a sidewalk, or a stabbing or a shooting in a public place, or a Friday night football game, or a Saturday, a Saturday farmers market, an incident happening. But if you step back from that, I would argue that that's a much more manageable condition for us. And in some ways, the terrorist threat we face in the United States right now is not all that different from other forms of violence that we face here inside the United States. It is more unsettling if it's tied to someone who's viewed as carrying around a foreign ideology, a terrorist ideology. But I would argue we have it within our capacity to manage that kind of threat. It takes hyper-vigilant and aggressive law enforcement work. It takes hyper-aggressive and vigilant intelligence work, but it is something that is manageable. And I guess the last thing I would say, Luke, is that one of the things I've had to learn over time is that you have to, in some ways, disaggregate what you see happening on the battlefield overseas sometimes from the actual threat condition. There's no doubt that over the past few years, we've done tremendous work as a country working with partners overseas in squeezing ISIS, the Islamic State, in shrinking the size of the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, in preventing the further expansion of ISIS around the world. On the battlefield, in every way you can traditionally measure, we are winning. And yet I would argue that that is not necessarily translating into a threat environment here that is of less concern. And that's just a reality that I think we're going to have to face for the foreseeable future. It's an ideology, again, as Clint alluded, that we have not yet found a way to counter successfully. I held a conference during my last year as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and the question we asked was, how does it all end? Meaning this post-9/11 concern or fear about terrorism. And our answer was, it doesn't end, at least in the medium term or the near term. Maybe over decades or over generations it does, but certainly not in that time horizon that matters to you or to me.
So yeah, I agree. So the FBI recently, I mentioned homegrown violent extremists, and what is that exactly? To us, that is the most elusive target to go after, because that could be anyone that you know, right? It's a disturbing trend that we're starting to see, that anyone you know is actually becoming younger. A lot of cases we are 13-year-olds to the 17-year-old range who are somehow being brought into this ideology through social media. And ISIS, they are on the retreat. They are, they're losing territory, but they haven't lost their ability to communicate. Once again, making it more difficult for us. The whole dark web, the whole everything you hear about that, how they communicate encrypted through these different means, and also how they just send it out. They have a very polished media platform where they send their message out, and it hits these disillusioned individuals, and it resonates in them. And it causes them to, over time, sometimes long periods, sometimes short, to radicalize and then activate. Not just here in the United States, but in Europe as well. And for us, it's very difficult because these people are not on our radar, and they're not getting any direct instruction from that foreign terrorist organization. They're just picking it up on their own and then deciding to go ahead and do something. So how do we handle a situation like that? Because they're not going to be on our radar. That's a very big challenge for us. It's incredibly difficult, and you know, like the director said, we're not. The threat of that large scale of attack is definitely diminished. I mean, there was a time after 9/11 where we feared everything from nuclear bombs going off to ships being captured and blown up and all these things. Listen, they still aspire for such things. Do not get it wrong, especially Al-Qaeda. You know, they still want that big attack. And then if ISIS could do it, they would do it as well, because we see them do it. But they've really perfected the cottage industry of terrorism. And to us, that's, you know, it's unacceptable. Because it's our prime. We are the prime agency responsible for counterterrorism investigations. So for us, we can never take our eye off the ball, no matter how small or how big. We have shifted a lot of our focus in CONUS, the United States, because of this HVE threat. That doesn't mean we're ignoring what we used to do overseas with our international partners, but the focus is on the homeland now to try and mitigate the threat as best we can. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
Can I double down on just two things
Sure.
that Clint said? First of all, the one caveat to this concern about large-scale attacks is something that he mentioned, and that is aviation. Al-Qaeda and ISIS both, if you look at the kind of intelligence picture over the last several years, they continue to prioritize an effort to use aviation as a means to strike out against the West and against the United States. So remember that the next time you're in a line at an airport, be kind to your TSA officer, because, and I'm not joking about that, because the bad guys are finding ever more creative and clever ways to hide explosives, to defeat the security arrangements that exist around the world at airports. And remember, when you're in the aviation system, you're sometimes always at the mercy of the weakest link in that system. Mm-hmm. And so that remains a vulnerability, even as the threat has changed, as I think we have both said, to being largely one of kind of lone actor, homegrown extremists here in the United States. And I'll just say one other thing about that. Because it's such a difficult law enforcement problem, you know, as Clint said, figuring out who those individuals are who are doing that inside their own heads and haven't actually taken any action that would bring them to the attention of FBI or law enforcement, because those individuals are operating in that way, it's a community problem every bit as much as it is a law enforcement problem. And it's one of the things I'm trying to do at the McCain Institute, is try to find a way to share more information with communities around the country to understand what are the risk factors, what are the indicators, what are the warning signs that you might see that would tell you that someone in a classroom or in your community or in your neighborhood is somehow headed on that path towards potentially adopting a terrorist ideology. Because often, if you wait until the point at which a crime has been committed, you're way too late in the conversation. Yeah. So if we can equip communities around the country more with information so that they can, in a sense, community police or self-police, that would, I think, give us a leg up on defeating this threat.
I'm going to jump in here. I couldn't really cut him off there with that plug, but we're going to transition to the and you've nicely traced the landscape, and I think we all appreciate it. We're going to pick up on what I see. I want to hear from you about kind of seams and gaps in a second, but surprise us. This next question is, how are we engaged now that from what you know and how we've learned the landscape, and how are we better and smarter? Where are we out there in ways that people would be surprised?
Well, if I may, can I dovetail on what he said there?
Well, you want me to lose control of my panel?
No.
Go ahead. No.
No, listen, I'm the FBI. I'm here to help.
Now I'm really getting scared. All right. Go ahead.
So you're absolutely right. And I had this discussion, I believe with you last night, maybe with the general, about how we need a community effort to try and police this. And it's one of the things I talk about when I go out and speak to industry, whether it's aviation, maritime, whoever. I try to impress upon them that from our studies of the actual cases of self-radicalized terrorists in the United States, there always was a progression that someone had noticed a change, right? Whether it was family, friends, coworkers, whoever, they recognized that the individual's behavior was drastically becoming different, but yet they failed to notify someone about it. The other part of the equation, which we probably don't even have time to go into, is that there's also a mental health equation to this whole factor. That we've, in the past 6 months, I was part of pushing out to all 56 field offices an initiative to reach out to your mental health officials within each state and each field office, the FBI, to have a direct link with someone who works that issue, because that is not a federal issue to the mental health problem, but we are definitely concerned about it because a lot of these individuals have had mental health problems and they were diagnosed as such, but somehow no one ever got involved with their lives to redirect them in a way to keep them on that path where they went and did a mass shooting or self-radicalize into some kind of jihadist type of threat. So once again, a very difficult equation. I mean, the whole mental health problem is a very, very challenging issue for law enforcement in general, because there's only so much we can do about it. So the message that we're trying to get to the community is that you need to engage with these individuals early and often to keep them on a straight path, whether that is counseling or medication or whatever it takes. And the same thing with those individuals where you see it's on that process of radicalizing. You need to engage with law enforcement either at the local or federal level and let us know about them and let us do our job to try and keep them before they get to that point where they're going to cause someone harm. So
I mean, you're talking about a very important coming together. That's just a big reason why we're really proud to be partnered with the World Affairs Council and others. I want to give another shot at this part.
I can handle I'll help you exercise some discipline, right. Luke. 2 areas where I can tell you for sure that we are far, far better, and we've closed gaps that existed certainly in the period after 9/11. One of those is in the simple mechanical issue of identity management, knowing who's coming in and out of the country. We now have a much more mature and comprehensive watch listing system that feeds a TSA screening system and feeds a border control system that allows us to know far, far better than we did at the time of 9/11 who's coming into the United States and whether that person should be allowed into the United States or not. I am not here to tell you that capability is flawless and without room for improvement. But if you look back to where we were at the time of 9/11, where we had different databases maintained by each department agency, some of them even in literally file card boxes at the time of 9/11 as opposed to being computer-based, we are legions ahead of where we were at the time of 9/11 in identity management. It is still, unfortunately, a system that's on the wrong side of history because it's based on names and not on biometric information. And as you know, the only way to ultimately be confident of someone's identity is to have their biometric information. But we're way, way ahead of most of the rest of the world and certainly ahead of where we were as a country. Second area where I think we've closed a significant gap, and I think it was one that needed to be closed, was in our information sharing practices, both within the federal government, but also with state, local, and other partners around the country. Again, what was the problem at the time of 9/11? It was stovepiped information. It was information that was held in one agency, not necessarily being shared with or mixed with information held in another agency so that we could have the full picture. I would argue now that we are, while not perfect, at least now there's a tremendous bias in favor of sharing information with your partners in other agencies sooner rather than later, in part because that's the best way to be effective, but also as a matter of organizational preservation. Who wants to be caught holding that bit of information about a potential terrorist attack and not having shared it with the FBI so the Bureau could do something about it, or the CIA so that the CIA could get after the target overseas? So I think we're way ahead of where we were at the time of 9/11 there. And that's the vertical or the horizontal sharing that goes on across the federal government. But there's also a vertical sharing that goes on between the federal government and all of the state and local partners that we have around the country. And that is another area. You now have in most major metropolitan areas police officers and senior officials who hold clearances. Classified information from Washington can be shared with them in the event that it is required. We share information about terrorist tactics. We share information about how terrorists operate. All of that designed to make those partners in local law enforcement effective in policing their communities. And again, Would I argue that we're perfect at this? Certainly not. And there's probably even some, in this room some local law enforcement official who knows we could be doing this better. But again, if you compare to where we were at the time of 9/11, where we just didn't think it was any of their damn business for the most part, I would argue that we're doing much better.
So I see Clint shaking his head. I know you would have a lot to add to this, but I do want to move to our next question because I want to make room for our audience here soon to jump in. So you can't go to the battlefield without strategy and good strategy. So this kind of gets at the seams and gaps that I was talking about. You know, is it nation states? Is it these other entities? You hear people say, have we kind of turned our back on terrorism? We have a new national strategy in play, if I'm not mistaken. Talk about that. And let's start with you, Clint. I mean, you know, strategies up here, you're certainly up there as well, but you're also kind of right at that operation and tactical. How does it shake out for you?
Well, if you talk about nation states as they pose a threat as terrorism, I mean, the biggest one out there is Iran, right? I mean, and its radical arm of Hezbollah, that they certainly pose a very potential threat from a strategic standpoint down the road, and something that we're cognizant of and we're working closely with, because the more pressure you put on Iran and its oligarchy of power, the more likely it would be that they would lash out and activate those Hezbollah troops that are throughout the world to attack not just us but our allies. So that's a very real threat, a very strategic threat, not so much a tactical, operational one right at this moment, but it could easily become one.
But what's our strategy, would you say, against that?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, how do we deal with them? I mean, the best way to deal with that would be to bring about some type of regime change. But I'm not. I mean, that's.
Yeah, that one. Okay.
That's a
strategy's tough.
Yeah, all right. But I mean, from a big grand strategy point, and we just did an overall review of the FBI Counterterrorism Division. We're taking a new look at the how it seems like every time a new assistant director comes in, we take a look at trying to realign the Counterterrorism Division and make sure that we're more effective in what we do, making sure we have the right assets where they need to be. But I think the strategy is pretty much what I said. It's CONUS based now, with assistance to our allies. We are very much involved in the National Joint Terrorism Task Force with our Airpol, Railpol, Interpol partners in Europe. We constantly have people coming through the National Counterterrorism Center from entities from all around the world, because, believe it or not, the concept of a joint task force is very foreign to foreign countries. They don't have that same level of information sharing like we talked about. You have 40 different agencies at the National Joint Terrorism Task Force, and we share everything openly all the time. And when they see that, they're somewhat astounded by it all. But we try and tell them it's very easy. It's just you get everyone together and you just share information. It's not that difficult. But it's really it's eye-opening every time someone comes in and they're. So the strategy is to continually be engaged with these people, with our partners, because we're concerned about the inside threat. We need them to be concerned about the threat that's emanating from their domain, so that they don't flood over into us. Because one of the biggest things that we need to worry about as ISIS starts to collapse is the tens of thousands of foreign fighters who moved to Syria and Iraq to fight and now have become very proficient at killing, and will at some point move back to their home countries as the caliphate starts to crumble. Now, Europe is going to become probably a war, a battlefield likes of which the 100 Years' War, probably you could harken back to that. I mean, because you're going to have literally thousands of foreign fighters who possess passports for these countries returning to them. So once again, we're talking about the vetting issue. We're working closely, especially the division of the FBI that I'm in. We do all kinds of the vetting through different databases and stuff, and we're working with our foreign partners to help them with that.
So I see Nick nodding his head quite a lot on this one. So I'm going to give this question just kind of a half twist and let Nick give a pretty quick response because we really do need to go to our audience. But what I'm trying to pull out, and you did, we're getting there. You know, our adversaries get a vote, but alliances and how we share information and how we partner, and then maybe Nick even talk to the private side of this equation as well. Information is what I get very interested in. We got to protect it. We got to you know, not let people get at it. But then if you don't share information, and then there's the whole disinformation, which would be a whole separate panel.
Exactly.
But give us a minute on.
So just 2 quick points there. One is Luke mentioned that recently the Trump administration put out a new national strategy for counterterrorism. And it happened to come out the same week as the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, so no one paid attention to much of anything that week other than the Supreme Court nomination hearings. But if you give that a careful reading, as different as Obama and Trump administrations are in a million different ways, and I don't need to coach you guys on that, the fundamentals of that that counterterrorism strategy from the Trump administration don't look all that different than what you would have seen in an Obama administration document. The tone and character of some of the rhetoric is different, but the toolkit that you rely upon to achieve our objectives in counterterrorism is the toolkit that we've been using for most of the period since 9/11. It's what we've been talking about. The ability to go on the offense overseas using all of our kinetic strength to bring our most threatening terrorist adversaries to an untimely end. The ability to share information and share intelligence with partners overseas who can either through their own activities can mitigate the terrorist threat. Sharing information here inside the United States with the private sector, with local government, all of that. And then working to try to undermine over time those conditions or improve those conditions over time that lead to extremism. So that the fundamentals, the kind of blocking and tackling of the counterterrorism work that has been underway since 9/11, I actually don't think changes much from administration to administration, despite the fact that you'll hear very different tonal or rhetorical ways of talking about that.
With that, it's your turn. I just ask that you let us know who you are, and if you have an affiliation, share that, and don't be bashful. Looks like we have a question right over here. And maybe tell, if you have somebody in mind for your question, let them know that as well.
Hi, my name is Robbie Stjanovich. I have a couple questions. First of all, how are we working with you've mentioned the ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but also how we're working with, say, neo-Nazi terrorism in the U.S. Also, you mentioned aviation, but how are we also working with, say, modern piracy? And I say modern piracy rather than the folklores of the 1600s and 1700s. And furthermore, how are we doing this and yet not have an Orwellian society?
Do you want me to start?
You want to do the DT one? Why don't you?
Okay, so as I mentioned, last year alone we had 120 DT cases that were...
DT is domestic terrorism.
Domestic terrorism cases. With the political atmosphere you see today, and with the help of some of those nation-state actors, Russia in particular, those domestic terrorism cases have become more of a problem for us. They've become, and we foresee as it goes on that our focus on that will also be increased because, like you said, what are your neo-Nazi, white supremacists, black separatists, I mean, the whole gambit of these different individuals. The one unique thing about the domestic terrorism side of the house is that there is no domestic terrorism violation, right? There's no material support to domestic terrorism like there is for international terrorism. So how do we disrupt these cases? Most of them are disrupted through good old-fashioned criminal work. So you take like a sovereign citizen case, and most of the time, well, almost all the time, they're involved in some type of criminal activity, whether it's fraud or counterfeiting or whatever you would say. And that's how we go after them, right? Because we have to, with the domestic side, you have to be concerned. You have your rights, free speech, right, and all that, right? So no matter how horrid that speech may be, in the United States, you can still say it as long as you're not going to yell fire in this building and people run out, right? But it's when you take that ideology and you apply a criminal act to try and bring about some type of political change, then it falls into the domestic terrorism side of the house. And that's when we go after these individuals. So that's, yeah, it's not that we're not focused on it. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. We probably will get more hyper-focused on that and continue to do so for the near future.
Piracy?
Well, piracy is just piracy in the modern era is really economics. Okay, they may be affiliated, like off the coast of Somalia, they may be affiliated with El Shabaab or whatever, but really they're just doing it for money, right? So they'll go out and they know if they capture an oil tanker and they anchor it out there, someone eventually will pay ransom to let it go. And that's really it's not so much an issue on our side for that. Yeah.
And I guess the question of how do we maintain an effective counterterrorism approach without slipping into some Orwellian society where the government is watching and looking at everything you do? Well, there's a quite an elaborate rules framework in place that governs how individuals working at the National Counterterrorism Center or the FBI, what kind of information they're allowed to look at, how long they're allowed to hold that information, what they are entitled to do with that information. And there's actually a pretty, I would argue, rigorous framework in place to make sure that when mistakes are made, when someone steps on the wrong side of that line, that something is done about it. And speaking personally, I worry far more about what I'm sharing every day involuntarily via the Google machine than I do worrying about what the Bureau is doing poking through my emails. Because if the Bureau is poking through my emails, it's because I've done something that brought me to the Bureau's attention where they should be.
You got a problem.
I got a problem. But as you know, all you have to do is look on your iPhone to see that Google knows what you want to buy tomorrow. And I find that at least as concerning.
Very true.
Stan, we've got another question to my right. I don't want the left side to let us down. Okay, so we're going to go here and then we're going to go there. So just here.
Thank you very much to share this insight of this anti-terrorism challenges. I would like to ask you from your classification. Okay,
So
sure.
we can hear who you
Okay,
are
my
and then-
name's Dr. Jason Liu. I have a private company dealing with intellectual capital and network research. I think from the very high level discussion, it seems to be that challenges moving away from a centralized, planned network to a non-networked or random, spontaneous situation. Would you share with us what is the current counter strategy dealing with this type of unplanned, non-network, non-hierarchical?
I can answer that a little bit. Obviously, and we talked a little bit about this in the period after 9/11 when Al-Qaeda was our principal terrorist enemy. That was, you don't want to make it sound like it was the good old days of counterterrorism work, but in some ways it was a highly centralized organization that had a well-defined structure, and you could, with good intelligence and with good law enforcement capability, you could over time dismantle those various structures and render them much less dangerous. This much more democratized threat that we've been talking about requires a different toolkit. You still need to be as aggressive as we have been overseas in disrupting terrorist leadership in places like Iraq and Syria, tied to ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But you also need to be active in the information domain, as we've talked about, to counter the narrative that is mobilizing people to carry out these lone actor attacks, these homegrown extremist attacks. So, and again, as we talked about, you need the community much more involved in the hard work of getting these individuals either both identified and then off-ramped, somehow diverted from the path towards violence that they're on. So that's the strategy that I would argue that is adapting over time. But it's additive. We're still doing all of that other old stuff, going after the centralized terrorist threat of groups like Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But we're also now having to go after these lone actor individuals, and that takes a slightly different approach.
So we had a question. Sorry, Glenn. Did you want to jump in on that? Okay, we have a question here.
Good morning, third class Julia Benz, Coast Guard Academy. I have two different questions for you guys. So the first is that you mentioned after 9/11, we focused on diminishing the risk of a large-scale attack. If there were such an attack today, what do you think the response would be in terms of our anti-terrorism approach? You mentioned that after 9/11, we focused on making the threat of a larger attack smaller, and we've almost gotten rid of that. But if it happened today, out of the blue, which it still has the possibility to, what do you think that our course of action would be in terms of our defense and security approach? And how do you think that we would change how we approach and think about our future terrorism threats?
Wow. And we have 2 minutes.
Great question.
Wow, that is some, you typed all that down too.
Well, I'll tell you what I worry about. What I worry about is that if we did suffer some large-scale, particularly catastrophic attack here in the United States, the immediate impulse would be to politicize our response. And I say that irrespective of which side you're on in the political divide that we're experiencing in our country today. What I don't think you would see is what we saw after 9/11, which was a tendency to try to come together and try to find a way collectively to set aside political division and reach agreement on a course of action. I worry a little bit that there would be an impulse to, quote, do something without necessarily knowing whether that something, particularly if it's in the overseas environment, was actually getting at the source of the threat that led to whatever hypothetical attack you're talking about. So I would hope that reason would prevail and that we could have a very measured, careful, thoughtful period before we, just lashed out and did something. But the politics of today, I think, point us in the other direction.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I also would say I would fear that a knee-jerk reaction and look at our whole intelligence community and our law enforcement community and look because there was talk right after 9/11 that the FBI should be split in half, be more along the lines of how the British MI5 and MI6 operate, which I would tell you is not the way we would ever want to go, and I think that there would be once again, that rhetoric would probably start to well up again, and we would take, and I'm talking about knee-jerk reactions right after 9/11, and you were probably part of this, is the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, where they kind of just threw all these different organizations together, but really never built an overarching control mechanism for it. You have your secretary, but the secretary doesn't really control what Secret Service or HSI or ERO or Coast Guard, it's not like there's just not the same span of command and control in that organization, which makes dealing, and I probably shouldn't say this in public, but it makes dealing with Department of Homeland Security sometimes very difficult because and even within Department of Homeland Security, because I have most of those people working for me on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, they find frustration in trying to deal with their own organization. So we talk about a seam. I mean, there's improvement to be made there, but that type of reaction to create something from nothing and not really, see it through to the end and how it should actually function would be a concern of mine.
So I see General Jones has got the hook out here, and rightly so.
Yeah, you didn't notice how smooth
We're
that was.
We're going to forego closing statements, but I really feel strongly that I speak for all three of us when I say we really appreciate the opportunity to be among you at the McCain Institute. We're about leaders and citizens engaging with character and courage to get in the arena and not just be bystanders on these issues. And you get a gold star for that for sure. And we appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. How about a big round of applause for our experts? Thank you.